Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plot Lines. I'm your host, Connor, and today it's been a while since we've been live, so I'm very happy to be live with all of you. I've got Gary Ritchie with me to discuss the news regarding RFK Jr.'s possibly taking over the Libertarian Party, and we're going to talk about, some of the positives that might include, some of the negatives that might include, and also I thought Gary was the perfect person to have on this, being that I don't consider myself a libertarian necessarily, but I know he does. So it will be good to understand sort of, person who has much more of a, it matters a lot more to Gary than it does to me, whether or not RFK it runs as a libertarian. And I can see it from the outside, and I'm looking forward to knowing what he thinks about it. So, but first, Gary, can you introduce yourself? Tell my audience a little about yourself.
Sure. Gary Ritchie. I am the proud proprietor and owner of Hot Water History and hotwaterhistory.com. Myself and a former student, Charlie Westerman, and I have written a book, The Twisted History of the United States, which you can see back there. And we do a weekly podcast in which we discuss all things ranging from libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism. So I can go one further. I'm not just a libertarian, but an anarcho-capitalist. And how the ideology of anarchism, capitalism, and libertarianism in a broader sense can be reconciled. And I find that there's complementarity with our own Catholic faith. So that is what we spend most of our time doing. I'm a historian, theologian. I work in finance now, worked in economics, or taught economics. So that is my background.
Awesome. Well, I put your website in the chat. So if you're looking to find his podcast, find his book, go click that link and you will get there. So it's kind of crazy to me, though, that RFK would even be thinking about going through the Libertarian Party. I have not thought of him as a libertarian by any stretch of the imagination. I wouldn't have thought of his uncle as a libertarian. I wouldn't have thought of his father as a possible libertarian. And it was strange to me on the Michael Malice show, which I guess it's Your Welcome show, but it's Michael Malice's show. Brett Weinstein basically said that he was, a small L libertarian, and that so himself, Brett, was a small L libertarian, and that he would consider RFK a small L libertarian. What do you make of that, first of all?
To the extent that he espouses in some arenas and in some situations, a decidedly libertarian take on foreign policy. For example, RFK, from the libertarian perspective, RFK Jr., that is, has been fantastic on diagnosing, and then beyond that, understanding the history behind the war between Russia and Ukraine, understanding that this was not just some sort of wanton premeditated strike that was unprovoked. That, for example, the CIA, which also he has a deep familial and then a historical understanding of its nefarious actions throughout the world, had triggered this going back to the breakup of the Soviet Union, and then more intensely with the coup that was led, the Maidan Revolution in 2014. So he's excellent. In many libertarians have really lauded him as a result of his anti-war stance vis-a-vis Russia and the Ukraine. However, and this goes right into why there might be some confusion, beyond his economics, in which he espouses some thoroughly anti-libertarian views. A case in point would be that he's floated the idea of putting a ceiling or a cap on home mortgages and interest rates that would follow, so as to allow, in his mind, the conclusion or the end objective being that our end goal would be to make housing more affordable, which would do the exact opposite. It would make supply scarce. And any basic libertarian or any libertarian 101 class in economics would say that RFK's misled there in his economics. He's not an economic libertarian. So on that side, in domestic policy, he's far afield from libertarianism. But again, the attraction there is one, his anti-war stance, his hostility, and very much deservedly so, given his family history, toward the CIA, the NSA, and these intelligence agencies. And then furthermore, he was a champion, as if you read his book, The Real Anthony Fauci, during the COVID pandemic or hysteria. And then he's spoken out very forcefully against forced vaccination, healthcare mandates, masking, and the like, and been a champion and really trying to disclose the America's Dr. Mengele, as we should identify him as, and that's Anthony Fauci. So there, as to why this is a possible marriage or there's a courtship going on, it would be because of that anti-war stance. Although, Connor, I'm sure you're going to reference in just a moment his interview with Dave Smith, who runs the Part of the Problem podcast. And Dave, I would argue, is the St. Paul of modern libertarianism in the United States.
What's Tom Woods?
I'm sorry?
What's Tom Woods?
Well, Tom Woods would be the St. Peter, I suppose, in that. But these are the two leading figures in disseminating and making and popularizing modern takes on libertarianism and the core principles of libertarianism that date back to the economics of Menger and Mises, all the way through to the politics and economics of Murray Rothbard. So, and Ron Paul and his presidential campaigns. Those are the sort of three champions there of modern libertarianism. But so, yeah, Dave Smith had RFK on again, and RFK Jr. has been very gracious with his time with Dave. And they discussed this possible pursuit. At one point, RFK even seemed to offer Dave Smith the opportunity to be his VP or running mate, should he go perhaps libertarian, or maybe if he even isn't. And
do you
perhaps
think that
Dave,
was serious? Do you think that was serious? Do you think that was serious? Or do you think
I think it was a recognition that Dave Smith, as a guy who was a New York comedian who, with Robbie Bernstein, started a podcast on libertarianism and essentially comedy, has become a huge voice, not just within libertarianism, but within the broader podcasting space through Part of the Problem. And it's through the medium of comedy that he's able to, again, popularize the messages of libertarianism and sell it to a wide spectrum of people who were previously on different political persuasions. Dave came from the left, and so he understands the mindset of progressives considering libertarianism, but he's also very schooled and understands. He's thoroughly read in paleoconservative literature. He knows Pat Buchanan backwards and forwards in his writing. So he's able to, and then furthermore, for a guy who essentially dropped out of college and became a professional comedian, I would argue as a historian, he's very steeped and well-read in the history, and not just in the economic and political theory, but in the history that gives him a lot of sway, a lot of power. So I think there was a recognition on Bobby Kennedy's part. And in fact, later on in the episode, if you'll remember, Bobby said, boy, I'm glad I'm not running against you, because there was a consideration that Dave Smith was going to run for the Libertarian Party nomination for president. Mm-hmm. And he opted not to because of familial concern and I think just real prudence and sanity. But in any case, so he's ceded ground there. But Bobby Kennedy said, boy, look, I'm glad I don't have to run against you in the general election or perhaps in the primary for the Libertarian Party, because he is his greatest, he's the greatest foil into what I'm going to just briefly, and we can get into a lot more here, where I think the nail in the coffin, if you will, the proverbial nail in the coffin of a possible Robert F. Kennedy Jr. libertarian run for the presidency and being the Libertarian Party candidate is it's an impossibility from my perspective. And there are two reasons for that. The first is, for those of you who aren't aware of the internal politics of the broader LP or Libertarian Party is that several years ago, a caucus or a group within the Libertarian Party called the Mises Caucus, which is very much they are disciples of Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard, a kind of thin libertarianism that argues for really pursuing a principled, consistent pursuit of libertarianism in which we see a rapid diminishment, if not elimination, of major facets of the state and programs that were otherwise, by previous campaigns, seen as possibly able to continue even under a libertarian regime, as far-fetched as we all recognize that is. And then the Mises Caucus, under leadership of both Michael Heiss, who's the chair of the leadership, the Mises Caucus, and then through this takeover, as it's called, by the Mises Caucus of the Libertarian Party, they are virulently and principled in being anti-war. And they're principled on the economics of free market, defense of the free market, denunciations of all etatism or statism, and absolute renunciation of anything that smacks of any institution, particularly as it emanates from the state, but also corporations or what have you that have influence over the state, or foreign nations for that matter, as I'm sure we're going to get into in a moment, that have coercive power over individuals. So they're very, and Angela McArdle was elevated to the chair of the Libertarian Party, and she's a thoroughgoing libertarian, first of all, but also someone who was a member of the Mises Caucus. So what's the stumbling block there? The stumbling block is Robert F. Kennedy's intractable position on the war in Gaza. And if you remember
that was all the Dave Smith interview basically was, outside of that little bit of, sort of VP talk. That was all it was an argument, which I mean, you've got a lot of balls to go head to head with, someone like RFK Jr. when
Yes.
you invited him on your podcast, and he doesn't have to be there at all, to go head to head with a presidential candidate, especially a Kennedy like that, on this issue. And I don't, they were sort of talking past each other, to be honest, at some point.
Oh, you found that? I didn't think that at all. I thought they had a very robust exchange. I did note that at times I was frustrated by the fact that when Dave would ask Bobby Kennedy Jr. a question, I should call him Robert Kennedy Jr., but when he asked him a question, he would go into these loquacious, and then he did it was ironic in a sense, because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. did a lot of Trumpian things. He talked about his personal background, his achievements in this area, representing Native Americans whose land had been taken away. So he presented himself, and he is truly, if you look at his life story and experience, he has been an advocate for the downtrodden and for those who have been dispossessed of whether it be property or rights. But in this case, I think the most poignant moment of the exchange was when Dave asked him, "Look, sir," and you always know when Dave Smith, if you've listened to Part of the Problem enough as I have, and I encourage everyone to listen to it, to just get at least acquainted with libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism as ideologies. Those are good expositors, both Robbie and Dave, of the ideologies and positions, and really worldviews for that matter. But yeah, it's when he starts calling someone sir, it's a little bit tense.
Sir.
Yeah, sir. So, sir, I think the most dramatic, if you will, point of the exchange as interlocutors were when Dave said, "Sir, do you believe that Israel and Zionist elements," and I'm paraphrasing the question here, have undue influence over our governmental officials?
I was kind of shocked by him asking the question. I mean, not that it's not a question he might ask, but just it was kind of like, it was similar to when Robert Kennedy asked like basically was going to ask, do you think that basically Jews have the right to have, exist in the Middle East, kind of, basically, which I was like, that's like a pretty, like, to ask that question is almost assuming like that there's a possibility that the person you're asking doesn't believe that, which would basically, be a call of genocide, which I was kind of so I was kind of surprised by RFK's jump to that question as well. Those two.
Yeah, although that's a tactic that's often used to excuse Israel's barbarous actions against, in this case, the Palestinians.
Yeah, that's
So,
what I'm saying
yeah,
is that
yeah.
he was trying to, he almost, he seems friendly with Dave Smith, so it was strange that he was almost trying to paint Dave as, possible anti-Semite, almost.
Yeah, although you'll note too that even I didn't find it as hostile, perhaps, because Bobby said, and he later expounded upon the idea that he wasn't accusing Dave necessarily of being anti-Semitic or in favor of the eradication of what we might call the country of Israel. Notice we have to make that distinction, and as Bobby Kennedy does, whether there should be a Zionist Jewish state there.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of things that it's a very, what's the word? There's a lot of little bits that differentiate between, a a Jewish state, meaning, a state where no basically where Arabs aren't allowed at all, or Palestinians. I guess they're probably not
Well, they're
technically
allowed to be
Arab.
citizens, and there are
Yeah.
even Palestinians represented in the Knesset, the legislative body of Israel, and even in the courts. The Supreme Court of Israel has Arab Palestinians. However, again, they're in a permanent minority status,
Mm-hmm.
and the occupied territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are run as an apartheid state in no different way than an encampment outside of Johannesburg was run during apartheid in South Africa. So
Another reason why I don't like democracy, because
yes,
you can never get you can never have a democracy where minorities, and I don't mean that in like necessarily specifically ethnic, it could be viewpoints, it could be religion, could be
mhm,
anything. A minority is never able to really have any equal say, because obviously a minority is obviously less people. The majority is a democracy is majority rule.
correct. And the best attempt, or one of the best stabs, if you will, at that idea of creating a governmental system by which the will of the majority does not overpower the rights or the voice of the minority would be the U.S. Constitution. Madison believed that that was its lasting strength, its durable strength. And yet, once you start altering the fabric, the fundamentals of that Constitution, you end up having that. If you've seen that meme, Connor, of the there's a guy getting beaten with reeds, right?
Okay.
And the guy's labeled minority, and then everyone else is the Democratic voters. They're just beating
Yeah.
him with reeds, and they basically the meme often reads, "Well, we voted for this." So
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah, exactly.
there you
That
go.
so yeah. So, but Dave asked him, what was the question that you thought was the most
Right?
controversial
Does
or
does
heated?
Israel as a Jewish state, as the Zionist experiment of a Jewish state in the modern sense of Israel, have undue influence in American politics?
Right. Yeah.
And what followed was not just a pregnant pause. It was like the what was that? The Octomom several years, like a decade ago, when she gave birth to 8. That was the most pregnant pause. Yeah, I say 8 because it was Clinton Russell, who's another libertarian podcaster of great repute, noted that it was 8 seconds from the point in which Dave ended that question to the point in which RFK Jr. responded, to the point where he essentially copped out and just said, "Well, I'm not a politician and I don't know how to measure
Yeah.
that." It's just what is altogether a prominent view, I would say, especially among those with whom I correspond in the libertarian movement, I would say I'm Mises Caucus adjacent. As a anarcho-capitalist, I'm not voting. I don't vote anymore for the purposes or for the reasons that you suggested earlier. What power do I have to aggress upon someone with my vote? But in any case, and support by my voting this majority rule system, which is clearly trampling upon the rights of minorities. But back to the point of what is a major trend here is noting that the United States is operating not just in this hyperbolic fashion, it's even more extreme than that, of treating Israel as a 51st state. But more so that if you look at American foreign policy, as it's been dominated by neocons ranging from Hillary Clinton back to Henry Kissinger, the late Henry Kissinger, all the way through to the Podoritzes, the Crystals in the intellectual think tanks in the Council of Foreign Affairs and the like, we operate as though we're a vassal state of Israel. We do the fighting, we do their bidding. And ever since the point in which I believe it was 1955, in one of the first engagements with the Arab states in Israel, in which I don't know if that was the Yom Kippur War. Forgive me, I should be better at my Middle Eastern history here. But when Israel was at war and Britain and France came to Israel's aid and started fighting with the Israelis against the Arab states, President Eisenhower said, enough of that. And he threatened to call in loans, American loans, that had been, by and large, backing the British pound, which was really rife for inflation at the time. And right then, essentially, the United States, by serving as a circuit breaker to that war, once that threat, that economic threat, came from the Eisenhower administration, that war ended. And instead, from that point on, we've been Israel's bitch. I don't mean to be perverse, but we have been that vassal state, and to the point where first of all, we could get into my own theory about what happened on October 7th, but all that being the case, under suspicious circumstances, no investigation's been launched. It's just, this has happened. This is the cause. There's no thought of a false flag attack or anything to precipitate this, even though the Netanyahu government was in serious trouble, if you understand what was going on in current affairs in Israel at the time. So what happens? You have this wag the dog kind of scenario, and then justification for this all-out assault, which is just a humanitarian disaster in Gaza. So, and when RFK can't recognize that, even I was thinking as I was listening to it too, Connor, I'm so happy that you asked me to come on to talk about this. The Catholic doctrine of whether we're talking about just war or in moral circumstances, as we act in society as moral agents and as individuals directing our agency in the proper and we hope divinely inspired way, we have to keep in mind when we act regarding circumstances of proportionality, and that the power broker here, when we're really talking about who has the both wealth, the means by which to carry out attacks, it's so disproportionate between the Gazans and the Palestinians and the Israelis. And to not recognize, as I thought was a real fault of Bobby Kennedy Jr., among other things and problems that we would have with him concerning his issues as a professed Catholic, by the way. But he doesn't recognize the disproportionate power dynamic that's existent there, to the extent that he won't even go out and say, as Vivek Ramaswamy did, by the way, someone who was a Hindu but went to a Catholic school, St. Xavier in Cincinnati. Yeah. So at least he's informed of this. He said, well, there's no reason we should be funding this. I mean,
I'm not sure if you go to Catholic school, I'm not sure that makes you informed, but I assume he's informed by other means.
Right. And that being said, I think there's more of a potential for a Hindu to be more informed of Catholic teaching going to a Catholic school than a lackluster milquetoast Catholic who goes through and likes the cultural Catholicism but adopts nothing of the faith.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's also interesting enough that America is still acting as though it's a unipolar uh, for foreign situation. You know, that foreign policy can be done with a unipolar focus. But you know, there are backers that are not of, I wouldn't say strictly equal footing, but can combine into equal footing, and at least a danger to American hegemon in the region that could that can still support these wars. You know, if America was just, you know, post 91, you know, post 92, or whenever the Soviet Union fell, there was no question that the United States was the only superpower left.
Francis
And
Fukuyama, yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, so so but the United States isn't acting that way. The United States is not acting as though it understands that. The foreign policy people, the president, who is barely coherent anyways, is acting as though, you know, nobody can defy the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and this is what happens when empires are crumbling and falling, and the political interests who benefit from the continuation of it, well, they would like to keep at least the ostensible signs of empire around because it's advantageous to them. So, I mean, to think, and this is where I have to give Bobby Kennedy a great deal of credit. He knows how many bases we have abroad. We have, Connor, you remember from the interview, we have over 750 military bases on foreign soil.
Yes.
And what that has rendered in the Middle East, that has left in the Middle East, is just that American servicemen and women, as we saw just last week with the 3 who were killed in Jordan by the drone attack, they let them vulnerable and sitting ducks, and that is the best descriptor for them, because they're outmanned, they're outpowered, they're out there with the shroud of American technological military superiority. But how much did that shroud of military superiority, the foremost, best funded military in human history, how did it fare against a bunch of Pashtun shepherds in Afghanistan? America's longest and maybe most embarrassing defeat. How did it fare in Iraq War I, in Iraq War II, Iraq War III? It didn't. Yeah. It didn't work.
Well, having these military officers in different places, especially in dangerous places, is a perfect way of setting off a new war.
Absolutely.
And the United States is very good at facilitating, basically. Would it be a false flag? Would that be correct?
Sure, a false flag, like an Operation Northwood sort of thing, where the United States, really, we could go back to the Mexican War in 1846, wherein James K. Polk baited the Mexicans into attacking U.S. troops by claiming territory that was by treaty, for really all intents and purposes, Mexican territory, but U.S. troops under Zachary Taylor had entered it.
Didn't Lincoln complain about that? And didn't Lincoln complain about that too? And then basically, you know, he started the Civil War.
Yes, well, I mean, his own Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and William Seward both told him, do not try to forcefully supply the forts under Fort Sumter under Major Anderson, because that is an act of war. And he disregarded their advice. Whereas that whole war could have been negotiated to an end. And all this talk, of course, we don't have to get into that today, but all this talk about that, even Nikki Haley on Saturday Night Live has to go in and say, oh, well, of course the war was about slavery, when we all know that that's an ahistorical claim.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely much more complex situations going on there. But yeah, no, also, but just let's go back a little bit to the effects it would have on the Libertarian Party, and why, you know, it would be probably a misstep, at least for those who want a Mises led party. I mean, the Libertarian Party had been run by basically idiots for a good while. Joe Swinson or Joe Jorgensen or whatever.
Yeah, she was the last
and
nominee for president. Yeah.
who was Gary Johnson?
Again, that Gary Johnson is a self-professed
Joe
libertarian, but
Jorgensen, Gary Johnson. Was anybody that before, or who was the last person before that?
well, it would have been Ron Paul, Harry Brown.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, your recollection is so key to understanding what is so problematic of a potential Robert F. Kennedy Jr. libertarian nomination, in that the reason for the ascent, I would argue the major reason for the ascent of the Mises Caucus in terms of its popularity, pull, and sway, is because way back in, it was 2012, it was 2012 or 2016. I can't remember which one. Those confuse me all the time. But with Gary Johnson, the VP candidate was a guy named Bill Weld. Bill Weld was the former governor of Massachusetts. This is a guy who worked for the Rand Corporation. He's not a libertarian. In fact, he's more neocon Republican than anything that would sniff of libertarianism. And it was thought that it would be helpful to have him on the ticket because of his name recognition. You had two former governors of somewhat major, or in the case of New Mexico, not a really major state. But
would Massachusetts even fall under major for, like, I don't think of Massachusetts as a major state.
I suppose I mean a major state in terms of its it outshoots its coverage, I suppose, in terms of in terms of electoral votes, not amazingly important, but yet
it's like a middle of the, like, both New Mexico and Massachusetts.
Right, I'm not speaking electorally in terms of the number of votes, but if you were to say which one has more, I guess, political prestige or history, I mean, I think I can. Senator Markey and Senator Warren are the two Massachusetts senators. Is it Senator Lujan and someone else in New Mexico? I can't remember. So, I mean, just that was just my own individual test to see if that theory was correct about. And just historically, of course, Massachusetts has much more kind of pull, if you will. But so you have these guys, and Gary Johnson. I mean, he was pretty solid, but then he was squishy, and then he didn't answer the Aleppo question well. And if you remember, the Aleppo question was, he was asked,
what is Aleppo?
What about Aleppo? And he fumbled it. And then when he realized he should have just said, well, what does Aleppo matter, when we shouldn't be sending our sons and daughters off to foreign wars without any real cause of consideration of American interest, he just sort of feigned like he knew what it was, but really didn't in Syria. And then the idea of having Bill Weld and all these unprincipled individuals the thing with we recognize as libertarians, or those affiliated with the party, are hopeful that the party might ascend in political sway and influence. We hope that that's the case, but ultimately there's always a concern that if you pick someone who's very principled, that the ideas just don't have that attraction yet. But if we could get in front of people, and this is leading into why I think there's such an attraction, if you will, from Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s side, and that's he's running unaffiliated. So if you could have a, albeit minor and third party apparatus and support behind him, and then be able to, as a result, elevate, this is where the quid pro quo would come in, why libertarians might consider it would be advantageous in the sense that if they poll above, and Robert F. Kennedy in most states, especially the swing states, is polling well above the 5%, then the Libertarian Party gets federal funds and it gets ballot access. So with that,
but one of the problems with that, if
I'm sorry, say that again.
Sorry, what I was about to say is just that the influence of that, when RFK no longer, well, he's not going to win. There's no possibility of him winning. When he's gone, is there going to be a Libertarian Party? Is the Libertarian Party going to sustain any of the stuff that RFK achieved for them? Like, are they going to poll 5% later? I don't, like, above 5% later. I just don't see that working out for them.
Right. I mean, there's always an internal debate is whether the ideas just haven't gotten out there enough, and that whether most Americans would be in favor of them if they were ever presented with said arguments and policies for the reduction of the size, scope, power, and authority of the government. Or is it just that we have to have a principled, pure type of libertarian message and then hope that, as has taken place throughout history, this powerful, sort of principled and righteous political program eventually gains steam and is able to, and the purest of libertarians, I think, and the most authentic and sincere are also the ones that aren't partisan toward the LP at all anyway. So if, for example, we see Rand Paul and Thomas Massey, and in Maine there's a great state senator named Eric Brakey. If we see Republicans, now there are no Democrats because they're all statists, but if we see Republicans who are really advancing libertarian notions, calling for not just the reduction in the federal deficit, but the elimination of whole departments, as Thomas Massey and Rand Paul are doing. Or if, for example, a really good candidate like Blake Masters comes along, who was a former libertarian, described himself as a sort of Rothbardian, former libertarian in college, and then is more of a conservative now, runs in Arizona as a senator. Well, that's why Dave Smith, for example, as aforementioned Dave Smith, endorsed, and he took a lot of flack for this because he didn't endorse the libertarian candidate in that Arizona senatorial election. He endorsed Blake Masters. Unfortunately, I suppose the energy, or more so the complacency of the electorate in Arizona, if it was valid, went with the incumbent Mark Kelly, who was really a disaster.
Well, if America is known for loving disasters, I don't know how else you can argue otherwise. I think we love disasters, especially the ones we already know and love.
Yeah, and those disasters, whether they be 9/11 or the Lusitania, the attack on Pearl Harbor that was provoked by the United States toward the Japanese, and of which the Roosevelt administration had certain knowledge of. Well, we love these disasters, and like, what was it, Rahm or Ezekiel Emanuel, never let a good crisis go to waste, and it's always to the growth and further justification for the growth of the state. I mean, the entire Cold War, William Buckley used as a means by which to argue for American totalitarianism. We had to defeat a totalitarian imperial state, communistic state, by what? Using the same instrumentality, which is just absurd to me. But that was the Lincolnian philosophy too. We had to guard the Constitution by setting it aside. So the Union's so perfect and so righteous that during its greatest crisis, the greatest test, we have to set it aside and not follow its formula.
Well, yes, there are so many politicians that have ran on peace and always went to war. Most, I would say, big wars have been started by presidents who have campaigned for peace, of course. So, and also the Japanese case, they came basically begging for friendship, and we sent them packing.
Yeah, along with disasters, Connor, we love blockading. And whether it's we who do it during the Civil War through the Anaconda Plan, or we do it to Japan prior to World War II. By the way, an island nation that was starved of natural resources, we decided to blockade and not allow the flow of natural gas, fossil fuels, and the like to go into Japan. But we love blockading, and we love it when Israel does it to Gaza. So yeah, we love a good blockade. Which, by the way, international law standards is absolutely considered a war crime.
Yeah, but I don't think anyone considers international law legitimate by any stretch of the imagination.
But maybe we should. I mean, international law is embedded within Catholic history. It was the first missionaries, the Spanish missionaries to the New World, who really were advocates and champions for international law.
But I don't think that's really international law. I think that's just law according to nations. There's natural law. If you want to advocate for everyone follows natural law. That makes sense. If you want to call that international law, that's fine. I just mean that if there's no enforcer of a law, it's not a
Right.
law.
Of
So
course.
therefore, there is no international law. It's more like guidelines.
Well, you're not going to get an argument from me because, what I meant by international law is having a standard by which nations, if they exist, ought to conduct themselves, even when they're in points of conflict. And when the Spanish and other European formulators, if you will, Francisco de Vitoria and the others were trying to form, or Bartolome de las Casas were trying to form principles of international law. What they had in mind was the idea that there would be standards in accordance with natural law by which everyone should recognize. It was almost trying to vivify, if you will, the old peace and truce of God from the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not going to, otherwise, I didn't mean to imply that I'd be anywhere in terms of supportive of any kind of body, some multinational body to enforce such statutes. I'm actually convinced that there's no such thing as the rule of law. It's a myth. And I would refer you to, or any of the listeners, to John Hasness's great, he's a scholar at Georgetown, a lawyer, The Myth of the Rule of Law, which thoroughly convinced me. And it's contained in Michael Malice. You mentioned Michael Malice before, his anarchist handbook in totality there with some commentary. So I encourage people to read that.
Well, I was going to also mention the blockade. I don't know if we participated in this blockade, but we definitely, didn't do anything to stop it. But the blockade of Germany and Austria at the end of World War I, that basically
World War I and World War II. Churchill didn't have. He wasn't. Everybody attributes to Churchill all of these mystical qualities. He was a ruthless, imperial, short-sighted, probably a pedophile during his lifetime. But he was essentially, whether it was his take as a reporter in the Boer Wars, all the way through to his forced blockade, which led to the starvation of hundreds of thousands of Germans in the hunger blockade in World War I. Well, he attempted to do that again in World War II as it broke out, but Hitler and the U-boats had anticipated that that's exactly what the British would attempt to do. So they had preempted that.
Yeah, well, I would say Churchill's biggest problem more so was giving half of Europe to the Soviets. I would say that's his biggest problem.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's such a important, and you don't have to look in through some secret archives, although there's a great work by Sean McMeekin at Bard College called Stalin's War. And his argument is basically we have misframed the entirety of World War II. That was not Hitler's war. Everybody presents it as Hitler's war, that Hitler was the cause. It should be understood in the framework of Stalin's war. But you don't have to go into some Soviet archives that were unearthed in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union to find that out. Just go and look at something as famous as the Sinews of Peace speech, more known as the Iron Curtain speech, in which I used to, when I was teaching in college and high school, I would just set forth the entire text from that Fulton, Missouri speech in 1946 and say, what's the problem here? And most of the students just said, oh, well, it's eloquent and Churchill's being Churchill and everything like that. I said, no, that's not the problem. The problem is he just admits that the emergent paradigm after World War II, the bloodiest, most disastrous war in human history, nothing compared. I mean, maybe World War I compared, but World War II doubles the destruction, if not triples the destruction. And he says, look, what have we accomplished? We, for whatever reason he doesn't cite, simply pulled back, the Western Allies pulled back and allowed the Soviet Union to take over half of Europe. We traded one totalitarian regime that had dominated vast stretches of Europe for another, and then cast for the next decade, for generations, entire peoples, as he says in the beginning, or in one of the paragraphs, the most kind of quoted, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended over Europe. That's why I always make the controversial statement that the United States and the Allies, the Western Allies, did not win World War II. Stalin and the Soviet Union won World War II. They got everything they possibly wanted and more.
I don't think the Allies didn't win World War II. I think everybody who's out for goodness lost World War II. Like I really do think the Allies won World War II which includes the Soviet Union, because they were part of the Allies. There's no question about that. And also, all you have to do is look at a map of Poland before World War II and map of Poland after World War II to know that something incredibly evil went down. Like,
Connor, 2 million German women were raped by the Red Army.
well, yeah, I'm just saying, but like, look, also, I'm saying, like, if you want some really like obvious visual thing on a map or something, of course, there are lots of stuff you could read. Of course, there's tons of stuff you could read about the atrocities done by the Soviets and just the, entire totalitarian state that came about through as you said, the Iron Curtain, which I don't think actually Churchill got correctly geographically. I think he made a mistake there, but I could be wrong on that.
Yeah, he was
but
generalizing, but to be more poetic.
Poland was moved west because the Soviet Union just stole half that land from the Poles and forced them westward. And then, we were like, okay, well, it's all the Germans' fault, so we're going to take half of their land in order to make the Poles happy, I guess. And then, of course, Poland became part of, the Warsaw Pact. So it wasn't like much of a victory to give Poland half of the German land when you're just giving half of it to an evil dictatorship. So.
Yeah, we kind of got far afield from Robert F. Kennedy and Dave
this
Smith
is the personification of what RFK generally is advocating against. He wants us to not play this role, though, of course, he has this weird attachment to Israel. That's kind of the quintessential thing, is that there's this disconnect where the same beliefs and the same philosophies regarding something like Ukraine is taken away immediately when it has something to do with Israel. And it's funny also, just like, if you, like, the question about whether or not Israel has an overblown amount of influence over the United States government and his inability to answer that question. I don't think it requires you to be a politician or somebody in the Oval Office. I don't think you need to be a representative to understand that so many decisions the United States makes is favorable to Israel and very rarely favorable to anybody else.
Yeah, and Dave, to your point too, Connor, if Dave Smith makes this point all the time, and I think he did so eloquently in the exchange with RFK Jr., he said, if you could devise a foreign policy that would be more disadvantageous to ensuring the future peace, prosperity of Israel, I can't imagine one. In other words, what is being perpetuated here? I mean, going back to Pat Buchanan, when previous campaigns, Israeli campaigns in 2009 and the like, had come to fruition in Gaza, Pat Buchanan at that time wrote, look, what is going to happen when these little boys in Gaza, who have lived their entire existence in what really is an open air prison, policed by the Israelis, what is going to happen when these boys, who have seen their fathers and uncles and grandfathers and their sisters and relatives bombed from the skies, by the way, many times using American-made weapons, what's going to happen to them when they grow up to be 20-somethings? Well, who are the same guys who are the rank and file of Hamas today? Well, they're the ones who experienced all that hardship, that tragedy that they saw, and they have an open enmity that is, I think, unquenchable toward the Israelis, and in many ways rightfully so. I mean, the notions that this is, like Robert F. Kennedy poses, that this is a what do you call it? He said something along the lines of that, that the Israelis are always seeking peace, and Hamas and the Palestinians are always seeking conflict, and they refuse to resolve or negotiate. It's just patently and historically false. I mean, the idea that even in an unjustified sense, when back in previous accords, whether they be Camp David or the Oslo Accords or whatever they have in these have transpired in these negotiations, the fact that the Palestinian Authority and even Fatwa and other entities and political entities, including Hamas, have even conceded that we would like a state that goes back to the 1967 borders, where Israel occupies essentially 57, 58, and by other accounts, 70% of the territory that they, by the way, had no right to occupy in the beginning and form a state, other than by UN resolution. Talk about a globalist entity that had existed for the better part of by that time, 18 months. And all of a sudden has the magical power of creating nations wherever it desires. It's just so, it's so disproportional, that's so asymmetrical. It just doesn't work. And that's what I think Bobby Kennedy refuses to do. And to your point too about the idea of blockading and the response that the world has had, they're not just people in Gaza and the closer Middle Eastern, Arabic, and Muslim world to this, but the Houthis in Yemen. I mean, we wonder why there were nearly 1 million Houthis in Aden or in Sana'a. I forget which of the capitals, but in Sana'a, there were just about a month ago, there were 1 million men in the streets of Sana'a protesting against the United States and Israel. I mean, this arrangement has been catastrophic already. It's only going to get worse.
To be honest, for one point, I do think that there is a strong hatred of the Jews in those places. That I do think that is one of the reasons why that they protest so heavily regarding Palestine. Because I don't think they protest very much because of Yemen. I could be wrong about that. If there's some international protests about the war in Yemen, I'd like someone to show me that. And then
quite small.
Another thing, just a sort of a problem I have with the way, like a critique, I guess, of the way Dave Smith argues. And I just want to, this is a pretty minor thing, but we were talking about international law. He brings up international law a lot about sort of, international law says this, blah, 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 and they're, going against international law. And then he kind of does bring up sort of the League of Nations, the mandate or whatever, sort of there, and then saying, they didn't have any right to, or was it the United Nations making up a border basically for Israel, and then basically saying they have no right to make that. Well, don't you think it's a little contradictory to be like, international law matters, but also the United Nations has no ability to enforce anything? You know what I mean? Like, I feel like they both shouldn't make sense. The United Nations doesn't have the right to create a state out of nothing, and they also, international law means nothing. You can make an argument of morality of some kind, and a history of moral wars or something, but I don't understand the disconnect there.
Sure. I would speak for Dave here. I suppose that he would offer this defense, and it would be my own, and that would be the Treaty of Versailles, which was dominated by allies, in which many people were shut out, including Ho Chi Minh, among others, did not represent a body that had the authority to issue, or for that matter, as you had earlier alluded, enforce what we might otherwise term as international law. It's not as though these were arguments for the pacification of or the post-pacification of an area, that hostages should be treated with dignity or something along those lines, or that certain targeting of civilians through total war should be avoided at all costs. Those are more standards of international law in that old tradition dating back to the Spanish scholastics and the like, and more so within church tradition regarding just war theory and the like. The disaster that was the Treaty of Versailles, which in part created the partitioning and then the mandates in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Palestine for the British and French respectively, or the French and British respectively, were disastrous. They were almost as disastrous, and the long-term effects of that have been felt, whether we're talking about in the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s or more proximate to the treaty itself, ultimately with placing 3 million Germans under Czechoslovak rule in the Sudetenland. So, and of course, one of the most heinous individuals to ever walk the face of the earth in the United States, Woodrow Wilson, was principally in charge of that. I don't know if you ever heard the story about when they broke it to him when they finally looked at the map. They said, "Well, President Wilson, there's 3 million Germans that you placed in Czechoslovakia." He goes, "Oh, so be it."
Yeah.
Okay. Well, he had no idea what he was doing, and he just wanted to see that war, and it cost Americans 150,000 men in World War I. And I'm afraid that if you look at the totality of all of the blood and treasure that has been expended and sacrificed on behalf in part of, there's not been a Middle Eastern war since that previous mention of 1955 when Dwight Eisenhower stepped in and essentially favored the Arab states and the Palestinians in the region. There's not been a war that Israel would not have backed nor willed for the United States to engage in the Middle East. It's all been or for that matter, a series of treaties, whether it's the pacification of Egypt and Jordan during the Camp David Accords under Carter or the like, or the way in which the Saudis and Israelis work together on many things.
One of the craziest arguments I thought that RFK tried to make in the debate was that they tried to make they had a Jewish state in Israel, they had an Arab state Muslim state in Syria, and a Christian state in Lebanon. And I'm like, Lebanon's not a Christian state. Can someone tell him that? It's not.
Well, it was majority Christian at the time.
Okay, well, but what happened to that? Just saying, you would have to have, if you wanted even to keep to that logic of sorts, you would have to keep that achieved. You'd actually have to maintain that balance of countries being, one religion and another country being the other, which I think is in a secular world, of course, that's basically nonsensical. So it's just kind of funny to watch, because Kennedy's not a Catholic in any really
in any real sense. You're right.
Yeah. So why would he care if there was a Christian state? He doesn't. That's why nobody talks about Lebanon in that conversation. He just brought it up as kind of a tool, I think, sort of as a
and if there was such a concern about Lebanon maintaining its Christian identity and population, of course the French did a woeful job in supervising that mandate, because, well, if there was such a concern, why would you place a thoroughly Maronite Christian country, although I think the ratio of Christian to Muslim was like 6-4 at the time, so it's not some sort of super majority Christian country, but certainly Christians are in the minority now, or anywhere around 28 to 30% within Lebanon. But why would you hand that Christian nation over to a thoroughgoing anti-clerical secularist state in France? It's not as if the French were going to build up the church as an institution there.
Well, they already destroyed the only Catholic country left in the world. So what are you gonna do? You know what I mean? They didn't have, even the that wouldn't even work. They don't have a Catholic country to give them to. I guess you could have theoretically given it to Spain at that time. I think would have counted. Maybe no, Portugal wouldn't have counted. Trying to think if there would have been a state.
The Knights of Malta. Bring the Knights of Malta back, Connor.
But they did they exist at that time? I don't know. That's what I'm saying. I'm just saying, you'd have to figure out who you would hand that over to. But like I said, that's not that important. Like, it seems to be the only religion that counts in this region is if they are basically Muslims when they are attacking Jews, and then Jews in general. And now, I
And
mean, the
Christians
left.
are caught in the middle. The
Well,
Christian communities
yes,
scattered throughout the Middle East, of course, caught in the middle, and that's the reason for
they don't
their
care about
rapid
the
decline
international
in the
world.
region.
Doesn't care about that.
No, right.
Yeah.
There was something, a point that I wanted to bring up that you had mentioned. Maybe it'll come back to me. Oh, what's interesting too is that unlike, well, Kennedy had brought up in the discussion with Dave about how, well, he even goes, well, aren't the Jews really the indigenous peoples to Palestine? It's like, dude, 27, and the idea that, okay, you could argue that the 7% of Jews that existed by the time of the Balfour Declaration's approval by King and Parliament in Britain, that there were only about 7% of Jews were living there, and they owned about even less amount of the land, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how are they the indigenous people? The modern state of Israel is the fruition of the Zionist projects of David Ben-Gurion and others, Theodor Herzl, who wrote Der Judenstaat in the 19th century. These are Eastern Europeans, many of them coming from the Soviet Union after in the 1970s, as they were given right to go there, and then especially at the fall of the Soviet Union, flooding into Israel. And then, of course, Kennedy says, well, shouldn't it have been seen as a benefit for Egypt, Jordan, Syria to take all of these Palestinian refugees? Well, wait a second. No, first of all, the Palestinians are penniless, and they've been evicted from their lands and their properties, and they're essentially given they're refugees, and they're supposed to. We see with our own refugee crisis right now, or Europe has seen in the past several years with their refugee crisis. To have these Arab states say, "Oh, come on in." Oh, and by the way, it should be noted too, some of those Palestinians are radicalized, so they even want to topple the, unfortunately, CIA and U.S.-backed dictatorial regimes in Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and the like. So that they cause instability. So that's the reason. It's not some sort of deep hatred that the Arab states have for the Palestinians. They cause instability, as any major refugee group would.
It's more like indifference.
What we didn't have in Lebanon, we didn't have crusaders flowing into Lebanon. Maybe if that was the case, Lebanon would be Christian. I don't know, but we didn't have that. There wasn't that migratory pattern like we see with Jews and Muslims in the region.
Yeah. Also, I've heard that this is a possibility, and I don't think people would want to do the genetic, investigation. From what I understand is that Palestinians could very well be Hebrews, just Muslim.
Well, that was what we meant by Semitic peoples, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't understand even Semitic actually apparently doesn't mean, apparently means language. It doesn't actually mean
right
ethnic, which
they have that shared history and linguistic heritage.
Yeah, so my point is that I think that it's, you should see almost more the Palestinian-Israeli war almost could be seen as sort of a brothers' war kind of thing, or at least maybe a cousins' war of some kind. There's a lot of problems there. It's basically, just look at in the Bible the way Samaritans are talked about.
Mm-hmm.
You would say, from the Jewish perspective, which I of course don't believe rabbinic Judaism has anything to do with the Judaism of the Bible. But when you look at rabbinic Judaism, I imagine they see Palestinians basically as Samaritans, which is basically like
or Canaanites.
Well, I think Canaanites would be more of a would mean that they were never once Jewish, though, or never once Hebrews, or never, and as Samaritans, they're basically traitors, whilst Canaanites would be at least just heathens. That they wouldn't have. I don't think Canaanites have as much disdain towards them as Samaritans, being the fact that Samaritans were absolute traitors. So that, I think that's kind of the dynamic we're having, and I don't think most people understand this dynamic. And anyways, so I just don't think that RFK is putting all of this together. But of course, it's because he has such a secular mind. You can't, like, I don't think people can understand this conflict with a secular mindset. They have to have some understanding of religion to
Sure.
understand, because it may not just be a religious war. It is now also sort of a land war and that type of thing, and even more complicated than that. But you have to understand the history, which obviously one of the great things is Dave Smith seems to have a phenomenal understanding of it. As you said, did you say he dropped out of college or whatever?
Yeah.
Well,
Or he might have graduated, but it
he's
was a junior college at that.
well, he's probably better off anyways for
Oh,
that.
for sure. Yeah.
Well, anyway, so uh, to answer the question, I mean, I posed it kind of is the title. Do you think RFK is going to or is trying to take over the Libertarian Party?
I think this was a flirtation that's going to end in a breakup. I guess a breakup comes as a result of the end of a true relationship. I think this was a little bit of playing footsie or dipping the toe into the water and seeing if there was any mutual chemistry going on. Sorry to extend this metaphor, but in the end, it would be a marriage of terrible inconvenience, and simply because, again, maybe the Libertarian Party as it existed in 2020 might play ball here, because you had basically a bunch of caucuses that wanted to see the ascent of more political voices at the national level, and that's why you had the nomination of women like Jo Jorgensen, who, remember, she was famous for, if you don't recall, really supporting the BLM riots. I mean, just
Yeah, she was like, you can't just be not racist, but you have to be
yes, right,
anti-racist. I think
precisely. It's not enough to be against racism; you have to be actively anti-racist, which was just straight from the BLM website. Which is great politics on the national scale, as cities are burning as a result of BLM protests. Great to be affiliated with that. So she was a disaster. And then, as I mentioned before, the Weld or Johnson Weld ticket. Maybe in that era, but not now. It just I think the Libertarian Party is very much of this sway wherein we're gonna present our principles, be anti-authoritarian in the best sense of eliminating this gigantic monstrosity, in my mind, a demonic monstrosity of its own genesis and origin of the federal government, and have people enjoy liberty and freedom and a free use and deployment of their human agency. And as I mentioned before, to counter, there's no way his domestic policies fit within the libertarian platform. In fact, he's not even agnostic, but he's really antagonistic, that is to say, RFK, to what we would aspire to, which is radical laissez-faire and free market enterprise, and a championing of the entrepreneur rather than looking for state solutions to economic or social woes.
Yeah, makes sense. If you were sort of an advisor position of the party, would you tell them to accept this or to send him packing?
Accept a possible RFK nomination?
Yeah.
I suspect what I would do if I was in Angela McArdle's shoes, she's the chair of the LP, I would find out what's the party members, prominent party members, and I know it sounds bad. It sounds like I'm being Nikki Haley of the Libertarians, but what donors think. I mean, that's important. And this is someone who, again, I've disespoused and divorced myself from the whole political process because I find it so repugnant. But if I was in that position, I'd try to get there and ascertain their thoughts, and then I would also make clear that if we're going to go down this road of wooing, if you want to use the word, RFK to be in Libertarian Party debates, I don't think that that's a problem in terms of trying to find an exchange or a fit. But ultimately, it should be understood that he's simply not a libertarian. I even among the more pragmatic caucus people who are much more into just winning elections and as many as prominent elections as possible within the Libertarian Party. I just don't see that they could even come to a justification for or an argument of how Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is at all libertarian. I mean, again, great on certain war issues and great on foreign policy in certain aspects. Total blind eye, as we spent the whole episode talking about vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians, and great on COVID and medical freedom and privacy in that realm, but horrible pretty much everywhere else.
Okay, yeah, you really love that relationship comparison, that metaphor you've been using.
Yeah, I have to admit, I don't know if people follow me on Twitter, I'm at hotwaterhistory.com. I am one of those libertarians that have not read Human Action, Ludwig von Mises's great economic treatise, cover to cover.
Okay.
So I found this to be a terrible lacuna in my own scholarship and understanding. So I took it upon myself this year to read it cover to cover. And that's what I'm doing now. And I'm tweeting and hashtagging Read Human Action. So if you'd like to follow along and see how I'm breaking apart and providing some, I'll use the word exegesis for Mises. Feel free to do that.
Awesome.
And so the reason I brought that up is just simply because he almost named human action social cooperation, and so he talks about a lot about relation in the book, and he uses that analogy. So I suspect that's where the metaphor is coming from.
Okay. Well, Gary, it's been a pleasure talking with you about this. Thank you for coming on. Everybody check out his website. I will move the link from the comment section to the live stream comments to the description in due time, so you'll be able to check that out. And Gary, anything big coming up? Anything you want to plug?
We're doing a series we have guests on from time to time. It's not just me and Charlie rapping poetic. We have the famous SSPX Canadian Kennedy Hall coming on later in the month. So we're going to talk with Kennedy about all things Marcel Lefebvre and what's going on with the Society of St. Pius X. And before we depart, I wanted to express to you what a joy it is for me to come on with such a devout, well-read, just knowledgeable individual. And I always enjoy our conversations. It feels like they go by so quickly. So I consider it a great blessing to be on Plotlines.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Anybody who wants to support Plotlines, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And God bless. Bye, everyone.